Thanks, Kevin. I think more people in this room know more about computers than I ever did or will. So I'm suffering from anorexia nervosa at the moment. Sorry, that's going to be the first of some rather awful joke. Thank you very much, Kevin. And thanks also to Stephen for helping to invite me here. And to Alex Mansfield, BBC friend and colleague who's going to operate the video, which is very important, and to Chris Monk for setting up all this wonderful equipment. The project, of course, one tends to think of it as 1982 because that's when the computer itself was launched. But of course it's gone on and on and on. In a sense it lives on today. I mean, I don't know if you saw this thing from George Osborne in the Sunday Times saying he was lucky enough to have been given the opportunity to learn the code basic. Not actually necessarily on a BBC microcomputer, but he talks about the project there because there's clearly an interest, a modern interest in doing effectively what we did, but in a new context. And only recently, Tony Hall's announced that the BBC will be coming up with some initiative, we don't know quite what, in 2015, and that's very exciting. The project itself had an enormous number of different elements, and it went on between 79 and 87. People think of it as a year or just 2 years, but actually it was a very long project. And it had the computer, the peripherals, 13 television series at least, a huge educational network, National Extension College courses, books like the computer book, the user guide and so on, helplines, fact sheets, all these things. Software begun by the BBC, packaged by the BBC and then by other people like Which, for example. It had a lot of overseas sales, which was very good. A lot of government support. It set up tele-software service, which I'll talk about later. And it had huge take-up. 85% of primary schools had BBC micros, and I think 65% of schools. But it was hugely popular, largely because, of course, the government gave them to schools. And in the end, 1.5 million micros were sold. Now, the story really begins, and there's a narrative here. There's a story that goes way back. And I want to show you just this tiny little clip. It was a very, very influential television program in 78. This was the end of the program.
What will happen then to the men in today's jobs? It's time to think about the future. The questions are these. Could this technology be the end of an age, the end of a line of evolution, and not a beginning? But in the short term, can we afford not to automate? If we don't, won't our industry be disadvantaged by the automated industries abroad? And if we do automate, will we be able to cope with the problems of large-scale unemployment?
The questions shout. What is shocking is that the government has been totally unaware of the effects that this technology is going to create. The silence is terrifying.
It was an influential program, and it made a lot of people think, including various government departments, quangos, and the educational establishment in particular, and the BBC. And my head of department came up to me one day, Sheila Innes, some will remember her, actually in the bar at Villiers House, and she said literally these words, there's this thing called microelectronics, I want you to see if there's anything in it. Literally those words. And she said that the BBC had been approached by one of the quangos, the Manpower Services Commission, to try and find out what was going on, if you like, to get an independent assessment abroad and in the UK with a view to influencing government. They were feeling that the Callaghan government wasn't doing enough about it. And two of us, Bob Albury and I, went to Japan, Holland, Sweden, Norway, Germany, and the USA to look at what was going on. We saw advanced industrial processes. We saw flexible manufacturing. We saw robots in car factories. We heard about what the unions were thinking. The Germans were talking about the chip as the job killer. But nonetheless, they were working cooperatively with management to try and get new technology into their factories. We heard about what the educationists were thinking, what sociologists were thinking, what training people were thinking. The main conclusions were really that there was a need for UK industry to get off its backside, for UK education to develop new skills, need for awareness by everybody from small businesses to the general public. So that was the sort of, if you like, the conclusions of that. But also, one of the conclusions was that the BBC perhaps should play a part by helping to produce some sort of awareness of the new technology. And philosophically, there was this question, do we dominate the technology or are we dominated by it? Of course, all these things have current resonances, which is interesting. Is it democratic or is it hierarchical? Our initial response really was to make a couple of series, which I made with Bob and other people. One for a general audience and one for industrialist small businessmen, because in those days the BBC made programmes for small businesses and professional groups of various kinds, teachers, doctors, that sort of thing. So just show you just a tiny little glimpse of two of those programmes.
And if the idea does catch on, then it could alter the whole shape of the industry, the people who make conventional styluses, record players, and the records themselves.
Companies like Philips, big as they are having to use the new technology in order to survive. This derelict factory on the North Circular Road outside London is a memorial to a once successful company which failed to realise that because of new technology, the world had suddenly changed.
Let's have a quick try of the machine. Tune for us and see if the motor will turn.
That's indicating that it will turn anti-clockwise and flatten the note.
Yes. There you are. It's going. That's
turn
it.
it clockwise and sharpen the note.
It's called sonic tape. It's not a camera. It's an electronic tape measure. It's the brainchild of Roy and his partner, who've more or less staked everything they have on it. This, not to put too fine a point upon it, is a knicker factory at Macclesfield in Cheshire. And Macclesfield is traditionally a silk manufacturing town.
We'll draw a veil over the knicker factory. He was going on to show a machine that had increased productivity by 150% by having a microprocessor-controlled thing attached to it, and so on and so forth. So we looked around for examples of new technology being applied and so on in that series. And Brian Redhead, the blessed Brian, was a wonderful, wonderful chap. And Bernard Falk, who died rather prematurely, presented the Silicon Factor, which went out mid-evening, BBC Two, and was quite successful, won a prize at the New York Film Festival. There were three programmes there. He was a hard-drinking man from news and current affairs, but he was good for that, I think. Anyway, so we did those two programmes, as it were, to keep ourselves going. We went scratching our heads as to what we should do in a more systematic way. The important thing was, though, that there was a model. And it was the adult literacy campaign, which was in the 72 to 1976. Perhaps some of you may remember it, On the Move. Television programs to encourage people to get the feeling that they could actually learn to read, even if they were trying hard to hide the fact that they couldn't. And the television programs were used as a stimulus, but behind the scenes there was a huge network of organisations set up around the country to teach people to read, and materials were produced for that. 2 million people took reading courses as a result of this thing. So the idea of the television programme being a stimulus, and then a whole range of things underneath, actually doing the educating, if you like, the hands-on stuff, was what happened. We were still scratching our heads as to what to do. Most producers in continuing education, as the department was called, could read, fortunately, but very few understood computers, let alone executive producers and skeptical arts producers. Paul Krivacek, producer in the department, and I bought kits of parts from the Edgware Road, and we built little logic circuits and tried playing around. And there was a man who kept writing to us saying, you must do programs about, bits and bytes and things like that. And so we had working titles for a program that we might make called Bits and Bytes or Bits and Pieces or Hands-on Microelectronics or whatever it was. But the point was that there was this strong belief in the hands-on philosophy. You know, you must get hold of the thing, whatever it is, and actually use it yourself if you were going to control it. Now, computing in the late 70s, very, very different. Can we just run that clip, Alex, please?
New companies sprang up to supply enthusiasts who wanted to build their own machines, though selling computers as kits did have its problems.
We sold the Atom in kit form and ready assembled, and what finally convinced us only to sell completely built machines was receiving back one that had been glued together. Every component had been very, very carefully glued in place with plastic cement, and the man who did it wondered why it didn't work.
Just a feeling for those times. I mean, I got hold of a TRS-80, actually, and I learned to program. But 1980 was a very formative year. It was the year the Sinclair ZX80 appeared. And Asa Briggs has a very, very telling concept. He has a concept of turning points. And he said to me, because I went to one of his talks, that he thought the BBC microcomputer project was at a turning point. And he likened it to 1922, when people took off their headphones and stopped fiddling with crystal sets, and radio sets began to appear in homes. That was 1922 when the British Broadcasting Company was formed, with Lord Reith there. But that was a turning point, you see. Suddenly the thing came into the home, and computers were coming into the high street, and people were beginning to buy them in Smiths and what have you. So think of that. So just in a couple of years, you were getting computers appearing in the home. And so we began to think of a slightly bolder project. Television, yes. Books, yes. Courses, educational support. But of course we needed machines. We had the hands-on philosophy, but we didn't necessarily have the machines we could use in a television series. Now, it's important to look at the BBC at that time. It had an increasing colour licence revenue, so it was actually not too badly off financially. It was strong and fairly confident. It's pre-Thatcher. It's pre the Peacock report and so on, which started to cause trouble, if you like, later on. It was relatively unbureaucratic. If you look at the pyramid then, it was a much more shallow pyramid, only about 2 or 3 people between the producer and the director general, unlike today, I think. Strong educational departments with their own controller, and what's most important, their own dedicated airtime. BBC education officers stalked the country. BBC educational publications existed as a separate entity, which published our books. There was a thing called the Continuing Education Advisory Council, which there were hundreds of people that came together at Broadcasting House to advise the BBC on what to do. It was an advisory council only, very influential. BBC Enterprises existed, now BBC Worldwide, of course. But in those days, they sold jigsaws, fluffy toys, and books. That was it. The idea of a computer, my God, you know, just think of it. There was a very strong engineering culture in the BBC. BBC Engineering had its own controller. There was a BBC Engineering Designs department that sort of solved problems. There was BBC Research. They were then combined together. There was Broadcasting Support Services, which was an organisation set up, you know, you would ring up and ask for advice, and you got really good advice. And there was a big audience research department. So it was a very different organisation in many ways to today. And it would be very interesting to see. I mean, the BBC has clearly many advantages over those times with online and so on and so forth. But that was a very different period. So again, so we did have a great army, if you like, of departments that could control, control, there's a Freudian slip, that could actually support any initiative we took. So what did we do? Well, we needed machines, but all these machines were different. They all had different forms of BASIC. And we needed good advice. Well, we got good advice from John Cole. Is John here? He's not arrived, has he? He was supposed to be coming. John Cole was chairman of a thing called MUSE, Micro Users in Secondary Education. And he was very influential in this in this whole project. He edited he wrote the user guide for the BBC machine, which I, for my sins, edited. But he drew to our attention, if you like, there was this problem. How do you teach people BASIC? Because BASIC was considered the thing that people needed to learn to do, to learn to program. Why? Well, there were virtually no applications programs in those days. There was business software, some business software, but there was green scrolling text on black screens. That was all, virtually, that you got. And so the idea of, as it were, getting hold of applications programs and doing things, very, very different. So we had to think, well, people should learn to write programs in BASIC. Actually, we know the whole thing is really about problem solving. It doesn't matter what you write it in, but BASIC was the thing. So what do we do? Well, we got all the manufacturers together into a room at Cavendish Square, and we said, we'd like to implement this thing called Adopted Basic for Computers, ABC, which was a structured BASIC that John Cole and Muse had come up with, and they persuaded us that this was, and the engineering people thought that this was a good structured BASIC, but nothing had it. So here was ABC, so we brought all the manufacturers together, said, could you implement this on your machines? And they said, on your bike. There wasn't any interest at all. The DTI was there, because they weren't prepared to pay. So what did we do? So we had a real problem. We needed our own machine, and that was controversial. BBC endorsing a commercial product on air like that. The DTI then suggested a company called Newbury. Now, Newbury was a publicly funded company funded by the National Research and Development Council. It had a thing on the stocks called the New Brain. This could have been the BBC Micro. Publicly funded, respectable enough, for us to be able to put our name on it. And we went to Newbury and we got them to look at how to adopt our little spec. The spec was modifying itself all the time. We wanted teletext and all these things, and we wanted colour and graphics and all those things. And they beavered away. And by the time it came to late in 1980, basically they weren't getting anywhere. It was a bit of a dead loss. Now, Christmas 1980 is a very crucial period, a very important period. Firstly, this device, which I've donated to the museum, it has my name on it, was a little calculator with a 1K basic compiler in it, and I lent it to John Radcliffe, who's the executive producer, who ended up as the executive producer for the whole project and really drove it politically. And we'd been to a conference, and I gave it to him, saying, "Take this home over Christmas." And he took it home and wrote, 10, print hello, 20, go to 10, all that sort of thing. And he actually sort of got slightly hooked on this. And I think that was quite important, because John became very key in making the project work. And then, what did we do? Newbury not come up with anything. So John Cole and I sat between Christmas and the New Year 1980, devising a document, a 2-page, a 3-page specification, if you like, requirements document. And we sent it to all UK companies, all UK companies which built computers. And we said, what have you got? Can we see it? Could you modify it? Could you meet our spec? And it included, obviously, a good structured BASIC, good keyboard, expandability, color, graphics, A to D conversion, sound, teletext. You see the number of things we wanted was going up all the time. And particularly the ability to be used in a studio so that you could get a studio output from it, which was crucially important. And we sent them round. Now, the companies that were approached are these: Acorn, Tangerine, Newbury, Sinclair, Transam, and NASCOM. They all made bids, and we started to go around to see them. And there was a critical day in January 1981 when John Cole and I went to, I think it was Tangerine, which were in Ely, to Sinclair in Cambridge, and to Acorn. And at Acorn we saw the prototype of the Proton, which of course effectively ended up as the BBC machine when it was adapted. And we were very impressed with Acorn. The other companies, for various reasons, we weren't as impressed by, but we also had to be fair to all these organisations. So we found out from all of them, and we visited all of them several times, and we had a group of people who met, including people from the DTI, people like John Cobb from Muse, BBC Education, BBC Engineering, all the engineering people were there. And we looked at the various submitted responses, and we considered things like compatibility, the track record of companies, whether there was upward compatibility in their products, what their attitude was, what their competence was, all the usual due diligence you would try. It later on got whittled down by February 1981 to Newbury, Tangerine and Acorn. Newbury was still in there, interestingly. And the final decision day, I forget exactly when it was, end of February or something like that, Newbury arrived, we were all having our meeting, they said, we've done it. And it didn't work. So that was the end of Newbury. But by this time, there'd been a number of meetings, some of them got very confused really as to who saw what and when. There was this famous occasion when somebody cut a wire and the thing worked at Acorn, and I can't remember whether I was there or not, but other people like John Radcliffe were going round. And so the contract was won by Acorn in that period, about March 81. The spec had increased. BBC were very interested in including things like teletext, but also telesoftware was coming in, the idea of being able to send computer programs by television. John Radcliffe was managing the Board of Management and Board of Governors, known as BOM and BOG, because it was a risky project. This was quite risky, going in with an organisation like Acorn. And they themselves, had a lot of problems developing the machine. And of course, it would have had to have been handled by BBC, BBC Enterprises, and the fluffy toys and the jigsaws had to make room for something slightly more ambitious. There was a lot of trouble from people who hadn't got the contract. Clive Sinclair, I can quite understand why, was very much up in arms about the thing. But nonetheless, we had now a machine that we could, and an organisation we could work with. And Paul Krivacek started developing the first series, and I was the project editor, the series editor, and I started developing things we needed, like the welcome tape, the computer book, the user guide. John Radcliffe started with the education officers organising the institutional side of the thing through the local education authorities. The National Extension College started on their 30-hour basic, and so on and so forth. So that all the underlying infrastructure which made the thing work was being done while we just went and made television programs. They are not easy to make, but nonetheless we got on with making them. Now, just a word about the welcome tape. I commissioned the welcome tape, and Mel Draper from the DTI was then taken on by the BBC as a software editor, and we used, I think, people like Logica or something like this to write programs, because we didn't know how to write programs of that quality. And the welcome tape, which I think we've got here, sort of covered everything that computers did in a way. There was a thing for sorting words into alphabetical order, there was a thing for drawing graphics, there was a thing for sound, there was a thing to show everything, except comms, of course, because communication things didn't really exist in those days. And one of the things we did was we commissioned Roger McGough to write a poem for us. You can run this, I don't expect you necessarily to read it, an interactive poem. And he hadn't a clue what an interactive poem was, and I had barely any idea what an interactive poem was. And I wrote to him recently, and I said I was coming here to talk to you lot. And he said that he had absolutely no idea at all what he was doing. And he says, nonetheless, say hello to those at Bletchley Park, and ignoring the above remarks, namely that he didn't know anything about computers, hint that the success of the internet, and indeed of computing generally, is due in no small part to my efforts. I did ask him if we could put this as a request for poetry, please, but I don't think I've heard of it. Now so it's all this sort of thing. You put your name in, and it then writes the limerick, which you expect to be quite rude. And then it did things like this, and it's really quite entertaining. So that. I suppose you better go on reading that till it gets to the end. How does it go on? I've forgotten now. I like that. Thank you, and how typical of you. Doesn't matter what you say, yes or no. Anyway, so that's going on. So the user guide was on the stocks. We also had to produce a guideware for software writers, because we were encouraging all sorts of people to write software for us. And BBC Education itself, BBC Enterprises was also trying to commission software. And we went to organisations like which did a tax thing called Tax Calc and so on. So there's a lot of software on the stocks, and so we produced things like that, the guideware for software writers and so on. There was an awful lot of work involved in doing that. However, we now come to the end of that period, Paul having prepared the programme. We had a lot of audience research, trying to find out what sort of people would be interested in this kind of programme. And the anticipated profile was, of course, men of about 30, 40, perhaps. Men, yes, certainly. Probably, if you look at the socio-economic groups, C1, B1, something like that. And that was the sort of prediction, if you like, of what it might be. And of course, it was all totally confounded by the results, which we'll show in a minute. Anyway, coming up to the launch, we ran into problems because Acorn had trouble with the chips. There was a supply of a particular chip which was very difficult to source because they were becoming very popular, and it was overheating in the ones they had, so they had to have them remade. And the whole thing was delayed by 3 months. This is quite embarrassing for the BBC. All these organisations, were all geared up to start going, and then there was this hold-up of 3 months, which actually isn't too bad when you consider what the industry is like in general. And here's a little clip here. This is of John Radcliffe, and me, I'm afraid, talking about the first, about the computer, about its aims, and then you see a little bit of Programme 1 of the computer programme. Now, I had nothing to do, other than being sort of series editor, with the computer programme. It was a very different animal from the things I made later. It was much more general, and it was intended to be. Paul Krivacek was working without really having a computer to work with until towards the end, and eventually it did appear and was used. I think there were men under the table who kept it going, but nonetheless, this is what John had to say about that.
I'd like to welcome you all to the Hobby Computer Club. I noticed there are
People wanted to learn more, and to meet that need, the BBC planned a major educational project.
Computers were going to be very important. They were going to affect everyone's lives. People didn't know much about them or understand very much about them, and the purpose of the whole project was to give people some understanding of what they were and what they could do.
In 1982, the BBC Computer Literacy Project began with a television series. Its aim was to allow everyone to come to terms with the new technology.
The early research we did showed, first of all, that there was a tremendous curiosity about computers, really on the part of everyone, not just a few specialized people, but on the part of everyone. But secondly, there was a very large degree of anxiety about them, and we wanted to disabuse people of that idea.
The programme showed ordinary people using computers, starting with an 80-year-old shopkeeper.
Phyllis Arundel wanted to know more frequently than her accountant could tell her precise financial position. She'd seen microcomputers advertised and decided that she too must have one.
I mean, it looked like a typewriter, didn't it? And I could operate a typewriter, and I was fascinated by the little bits that came up on the screen in front of me. and having a printer and able to press another button and it came out on the printer the same. It was great fun.
We tried to have a mixture, obviously, of showing examples of people using machines of all kinds out in the real world. And we always included a little bit of sort of hands-on in each program so that people could feel that they could get their computers and actually try these things out for themselves.
We have a program in there and we can put it into the machine.
Well, let's do it. Right, so far so good. There's a perfectly ordinary domestic cassette recorder.
Exactly.
Okay, connected to this. Now, what happens?
Computer literacy meant encouraging people to get their own hands on a computer. So to accompany the television programmes, the BBC team made a radical decision to commission their own machine. Just tell it to run.
Run. Nice simple English words, I must say. And return, I suppose.
That's it.
Nice multicoloured game, that.
It was really a machine that was designed by the educators. We went out and we talked to all the specialists in computer education up and down the land. We asked them what they would like a computer to do, ideally, for people to learn on it.
Okay, well that sort of sums up some of the things I've already been saying. But meanwhile, I was, because all the books were out of the way, I was beginning to plan the second series, which was really the series that really used the machine in hot blood, if you like. Mac had been, there was almost nobody on television, or nobody we knew who could present things like this. Nobody, there were very few journalists who were telegenic. I think it's fair to say. Chris was, the naive presenter. Mac was a mainframer, as he kept calling himself. In other words, he had a very considerable career in mainframe computing and so on. Ran a large company that supplied services to businesses, Comshare, and thanks very much. And so he knew what he was talking about when it came to computers. So we used him as the presenter for making the most of the Micro, which was the next series. And then we had John Coll, who'd been our advisor for the setting up of ABC and working with us on the computer and the development of the computer generally, as the man who knew about micros, if you know what I mean. So you don't have a naive presenter, you have somebody who knows something about it. So sometimes Mac would present something, and then John would come in, as it were, and do the coding. And we were dealing by this time with a machine that was quite robust. It was very important that it provided a clean output in the studio that we could cut to. And Steve Lowry, who's here, Steve was the studio engineer who actually made the things work. And more importantly, he wrote the software that we used for the demos. So any demos you see from now on, almost certainly made by Steve. Can we run clip 6, please? This is making the most of the Micro.
You may have seen something like this before, being used to deal with car bombs in Northern Ireland. But when the army are using it, they control it with either a wire or by radio. This one is completely free-ranging, and in fact it's controlled using a personal microcomputer you might find in your own home. It's programmed to find out just where I am. For its eyes, or perhaps I should say its ear, it uses a sonar rangefinder that you might find on a Polaroid camera. Not only is it programmed to actually determine where I am, it's also programmed to track me, rather like a faithful dog. If we were to look at the program that's controlling this robot, we'd find instructions for some loops, which in ordinary English would sound something like this. If the object's lost, then search for it by turning round. Repeat this until it's found. Then a feedback loop. If the object is more than 1 foot away, then advance. If less than 1 foot away, then retreat. And it will go on doing this until it's told to stop. If something happens, then do one thing, otherwise do something else. And in this case, we're taking the temperature by this temperature sensor, and we're feeding it into the computer and displaying the temperature's number on the screen and also running it as a graph. If the temperature falls below a certain level, we're going to switch on a heater. If it goes above a certain level, we're going to switch on a fan. And we can see if that works. We'll put it in some ice here. Immediately the temperature graph falls and the fan heater goes on. Put it in the hot water, get an immediate rise in temperature, the heater cuts off, and the fan comes on.
And then down here you can see how we control the device.
Yes, I recognise this. If the temperature is less than 30 and the temperature is greater than 20, then the coordinates of 65,120 is equal to 0.
Right, the address 65,120, you may remember, we had that address for the output port, and we have got two wires connected on to the output port, one of which controls the fan and one of which controls the heater. And if you put 0 into this byte, then both of these will be switched off.
Well, there's the next temperature. If the temperature is greater than 31, in other words, it's hot, then the coordinates of 65,120 is equal to 1.
And in that case, a 1 would be placed here, and the fan switches on.
And if the temperature is less than 90, in other words, it's cold, coordinates of 65,120 equals 2.
Now 2, translated into binary, we'll put a 1 in there and a 0 in there, and that'll have the effect of turning the heater on, but not the fan.
Our bug is still trying to find its way out of the maze. The interesting thing about this is that the robot is being controlled by an artificial intelligence program. In other words, it's learning from its mistakes as it goes around the maze. But what exactly is it doing, John?
Well, as you said, Mac, it's following a very complicated program indeed. Its overall aim is to get from the start of the maze to the end of the maze, but it's programmed to be able to cope with a lot of unexpected situations on the way. For example, it might slightly miss the line, and if it does that, you'll find that it'll veer slightly to the right and slightly to the left, as in fact is doing now, until it finds itself back on the line. If we look at the screen, we can see what it's doing at any particular moment. It's turning through 90 degrees to the right to try and find another black line at the moment.
Okay, well that shows a number of things really. Firstly, the BBC buggy itself was specially commissioned, and it was a great piece of kit, and Chris has got it working here. I presume it can go on working all night, can it? Going round and round?
I'm going to put one
in an invisible loop. Okay, right. But you see also the way we weren't ashamed or afraid of putting quite technically difficult things in. I'll tell you about this slide in a minute. So I missed it earlier. We weren't afraid of doing something quite technically complicated. And you see the way that John could talk about quite specific things to do with addresses in the machine. And that relationship between John and Mac worked extremely well. Now, I missed this, but it's very important. We hit the right period, if you like, with the government. This year, I think 1982, was it 83, was IT technology year. When we launched the computer, we put it in front of all the DTI ministers. Now, name the guilty men. Now, depending on your politics, you may say that some people had an effect on the railways, I think John McGregor, Norman Lamont on the economy, John Wakeham, I can't remember, Patrick Jenkins invented the poll tax, and Kenneth Baker was Minister of Information Technology, and they're all sitting in front of the BBC Micro, and Kenneth Baker is saying, "Ooh, it's a bit like a typewriter." And Patrick Jenkins there was using the little program which was the alphabetical order thing, you know, putting words into alphabetical order. And I saw him typing, Patrick Aloysius St. John Jenkins, Secretary of State for Industry, press return. And all these words would then sort themselves into alphabetical order. It's an absolutely lovely experience. And I love that picture there. Okay, right. So now we've seen that clip. By the end of 82, we were getting most extraordinary results, really. Audiences of up to 2 million for that kind of thing, with a bigger audience for making most of the micro, up to 18% of the population at times. That was the reach, not the number for each program, but it was the reach. So you've got more people, the more complicated things you put on in a funny sort of way. The computer book sold 80,000 copies. The National Extension College got 160,000 people enrolled, and they only had a 2.6% dropout rate. It's the smallest dropout rate they've ever had. Broadcast support services were running, and they dealt with 300,000 referrals. And the referrals meant you either answered a question or you passed somebody to one of a number of named people in different parts of the country. Every college of FE recorded the series. It was the most widely used series in schools, even though it wasn't a school's television program. The series sold to the States, Australia, Canada, and so on. We got the Royal Television Society Award in '83. Computers in Schools project was then started as a result of the year of information technology. And as I said earlier, we'd had 80% of primary schools and 60% of secondary schools are actually owning a BBC microcomputer. Whether they used it or not is another matter. So it was incredibly successful. And while this was all going on, people were writing more and more software. Remember, we'd gone from green text on green scrolling text on black screens to really quite interesting applications programs.
The children were desperately interested, very excited, rushed up as soon as the machine, I mean, we had to fend them off. It was easy to program. I was an amateur programmer and was interested in writing things that children would find exciting to use in schools, in classrooms. And the user guide was easy to use, easy to look at, easy to read, easy to learn from. So that was the first thing I found out. It was going to be easy to program the BBC computer. The second thing was that as soon as I started to use it, I found colour very exciting to use. I'd never had a machine that had colour on it before. I'd never seen a computer with colour on it before. So that was a real thrill. The real difference it made was that it turned British classrooms into some of the most exciting places in the world. And it's certainly true that we here in the UK led the world, as far as education was concerned, in investigating interesting and different ways of using computers in schools.
You print into the computer directions for it to try and go through the maze and hit the target.
How does that help you with your schoolwork then?
Well, I don't think it does.
And that's my son Hugo at the back. Well done, Hugo. That was absolutely the right thing to say. They would be taken in by all this new technology. It won't get you anywhere. Anyway, it was very successful, as you can see. And we then did, I suppose, something very bold. I said we had guaranteed airtime. You imagine nowadays taking over the whole of Sunday morning, well, 2 hours on Sunday morning, and doing a live program about computers with phone-ins, with an audience, with demonstrations, you know, dodgy demonstrations. We all know that they go wrong very often. And it was called Making the Most of the... Oh, we do have a letter from Mrs. Thatcher. Sorry, didn't tell you that. Yes. Addressed to the Controller of Educational Broadcasting. Sorry, I keep forgetting to move these things on. And we've had the Microelectronics Education Programme. So, Making the Most of the Micro Live was the name of the programme. It was 2 hours, BBC One, Sunday morning. I'm going to show you a clip of this because it's historically quite interesting. Not only was it risky, but various things happened. We'd like to show that bit. This is the opening. A lot of this has been edited down, as you know.
Good morning. This is Studio 4 at the Television Centre. It's 11 o'clock, and this is Making the Most of the Micro live. You may wonder why we're doing this programme live. Well, there are two reasons. Firstly, the previous two series gave an impression that everything to do with computers worked perfectly every time in a cool, logical environment. The truth was, if anything could go wrong, it would go wrong, and usually it did. So today, we're showing reality, warts and all. Secondly, over 300,000 people wrote letters to the project asking for advice. And today, there's a unique chance for coders, tech freaks, and even ordinary nice people to put questions to our specialists in software, hardware and telecommunications right here in the studio. And finally, we thought it might be a lot of fun. John Coll is with us again today, trying to find someone to send a message to using British Telecom's electronic mail service. And there's almost an open invitation to hackers to have a go, and we'll let you know what they are later on. And by popular request, we've got Dave Ellis, who'll be making music and the weirdest sounds out of a pile of electronic junk linked to a micro. Just wait for that.
The magazines and the manuals are completely non-understandable. It's gobbledygook. To be honest with you, the best book that I found on the whole business was yours, which breaks my heart to have to tell you. It was 30-Hour Basic by the BBC, which became my sort of manual, much more so than the Atari books. I read this, and it was written simply.
But an answer for the ZX81 competition floppy disk from Gareth Jones of Abergavenny, and he says that all our programmes load first time, which is good to hear.
Well, see what you make of this one. This is this week's competition.
Well, a couple of weeks ago, the BBC launched a new service on CFAX to provide free computer software. The manager of this service is Lawson Brown. Tell us about it, Lawson.
Telesoftware, as far as the BBC is concerned, is involved with transmitting computer programs and data using the ordinary television signal and CFAX pages. Now, because it's digital, we can equally well feed that output into a microcomputer. And to do that, we need an adapter of some description to take the information and put it into memory. The exciting thing we can do with it, of course, though, is to download software. And to do that, we call up the page number on which I know there's a program. Yes, it's coming down now. We can get about 1K of software for technical people that are watching onto a single frame. You can get a big program down in 5 minutes.
And what sort of programs are you sending down?
A very wide range of programs. In the initial stages, a lot of the software is going to be educational. And we're particularly interested in the sort of software that is not available by other means. Let's take in the Financial Times Index, Friday's close, from a CFAX page. It's now waiting for today's recipe to appear.
So that's kind of like a menu program that's going into various other pages of CFAX, pulling in the data and assembling it so you can actually see
That's exactly right, and it is very simple. That's accessed from within an ordinary basic program. No need for machine code or assembly or anything like that.
Now that was very important. Telesoftware had a very short existence as an educational supply, if you like, of software. Mrs. Thatcher, when we explained it to her, it's the first time I've ever met her, and we talked about 20 minutes about this. And what's her main thing she wanted to know was, well, is the BBC going to make any money out of this? And in fact, the BBC, instead of sending out free software to schools, which would have been a wonderful idea, actually started sending data, selling data space. I think the government technically owned the CFAX lines, isn't that right? Anyway, it was used to send data out to betting shops, anything that needed live data. Betting shops, banks overnight, you know, all that kind of thing. And the BBC data service existed for quite a few years. But as for educational software, I mean, they closed the microelectronics education software programs down. There was a Scottish one as well, I forgot to mention. But that telesoftware business also established the BBC in the whole business of transmitting data to intelligent boxes. And the whole business of the set-top box, if you like, I was told by BBC R&D, it was very important, this, because it got them in there and established certain intellectual property rights, if you like, for the BBC, instead of having to pay royalties for things now. So it's actually quite important now that work happened at the time. Now, I'm going to come to the famous hackers incident. And I need to explain this because we've had a bit of trouble. Well, trouble in a way. There was trouble then. John Cole was obviously usually poised to do a demonstration of electronic mail. This was using the British Telecom Gold electronic mail service, a very primitive service, but still it was working. And we used to use it ourselves within the team. And there was great worry that people were going to hack into the thing. And we went to great trouble to try and avoid hacking. And the thing was not to have the camera on the thing when he typed in passwords and things of that kind. And I'm going to play you something that it was quite difficult to edit together, partly because we've joined two things together. We've joined the program incident, but also the talkback from the gallery together. Now, unfortunately, the talkback from the gallery was recorded on tape, I suspect, and it slipped slightly. So the thing is in and out of sync, if you put up with that. So you'll hear Patrick Titley. I think you're in there, aren't you? I think you are. I think I hear... Oh, you sure? Okay. But you hear Patrick sort of directing the cameras. And you also get a feeling for the chaos there is in television gallery, but no wonder nobody listens to what's going on. So many other things happening. So you hear Patrick talking to the cameramen, having an argument with me about whether or not we should show this or show that. Cut to the live feed. Don't put the camera on the screen. And then the hackers actually broke in, and it was quite a sort of an investigation afterwards, because British Telecom Gold, quite naturally, were rather upset by this. It showed that their system wasn't that robust, maybe, We never quite got to that. I didn't know there was anything going on. I'm very quiet during this thing because I was looking at what was coming up to see if there was anything obscene on it or anything, you know, libelous. But would you like to play it? And bearing that in mind, listen to it.
4 minutes on this item.
Let's now wake up the packet switch exchange, please. And come on, reply to me. Right, and now it wants to know who I am.
Can we see this?
So this is the
right to see this,
code
David?
to get in here.
There's no password. I mean, nobody else can get in using this.
Oh, I see. And
That's three.
I do hope the cameras aren't on the keyboard.
Right.
There. Right, and now what's the address of the computer that you want to get? Well, I'll try and get to where we're getting to. 219.201.204.
That was a secret piece of code you put in there.
Right. Now we are now at last through to this last computer, and that's where I'm trying to get into the direct. Right. British Telecom Gold, we're through. We now have to type in our identification, what we said. Our ID is OWL001. And the machine asks what our password is, so no cameras on the keyboard, please.
Cut away, cut away.
Password is that.
Cut away.
Telecom Gold, made off services, we're through. Mail call.
Of course, it's only the keyboard.
Computer security error.
I think we have some hackers. I think you tempted some hackers rather too well. Illegal access. I hope your television program runs as smoothly as my program worked out your passwords. Nothing is secure.
Hacker song. Put another password in, bomb it out, and try again. Try to get past logging in. We're hacking. That's brilliant. Try his first wife's maiden name. This is more than just a game. It's real fun, but just the same, it's hacking. Yes.
Why do we do it?
Oh, no. ACN 019, had that alert for Oz and Yug. Now, look, Oz and Yug, just go away with you. We want to do a demonstration here. Go away. Right. Now, if they've left this system anything like intact, we should be able to do a mail scan and find out who's been sending us letters. I gather they've been coming in rather fast. Let's just stop it there.
Now, that is a list of all the letters.
All the letters.
Anyway. Well, I don't think that's been done before, but I'm sorry it got out of sync rather bad. It was my editing at home. I was trying desperately to get it to work. Getting all this together has been very difficult. I should explain that all these clips have come from a variety of different sources. And you know, in computing, there's you talk about first generation, second generation, third generation, fourth and fifth generation computing, and it gets better and better as you go to fifth. Well, with this sort of thing, it gets worse and worse. This is fifth generation videotape. So that event was quite important in a sense. It showed that certain things actually were best done live. You learnt an awful lot when things went wrong. And this is why we went on eventually to do the MicroLive series. But that didn't happen immediately, because before MicroLive, I think I've got the right order, the project, there's Patrick, he was the director of the thing. We used to use the kit in the office, for writing all our scripts. We used electronic mail for getting stuff about. We were doing such calculations as we needed to do on budgets using the system, and so I think we were amongst the first in the BBC to be fully automated in that sense. And Patrick's writing a script possibly for FREF in New York. He was our New York reporter who came in at the end of that program, first appeared in that program we've just seen, we used to send scripts backwards and forwards by email and then book a music line, and he would do a dub from New York. We went on then to do more series which involved more hands-on. And in particular, I'm particularly proud of the Computers in Control series, which Steve was certainly involved in, and we recorded it in Birmingham, I think. Is that the next one, Computers in Control? Yeah. Okay, so let's have a look at this. Again, bearing in mind what we said about the combination of, real-life examples with some coding and also having the two presenters who kind of got on very well together. Right, run that. The first thing I think we're going to see is just the end of the opening titles, which use a robot. We'll come back to that later for the big joke of the evening. This is one of the funniest things I've ever seen. This was in Orlando, Florida.
Creative Engineering is the company that designs a range of shows for pizza chains. They make all their characters in a factory in Orlando, Florida. Although the shop floor may look bizarre, it's an ordinary assembly line like any other. And this is the quality control section.
You can see the stepper motor steps quite slowly. The steps are quite obvious. I'll just change it to another value, this time a delay of 0.05 of a second. And in that case, you can see we've almost got continuous motion, but in fact made up of a number of small steps.
So the computer can keep a complete track of where that motor is at any particular time?
Yes, it knows exactly that one step, 7.5 degrees.
But the disadvantage, it's got no power. Suppose we want to use it as a DC motor, a powerful motor. How do we know where the position of that is?
Well, yes, well, you have to somehow or other sense where the motor has got to. Now, in a Ferris wheel, like this in a fairground...
Built, no doubt, by Steve once again.
Oh, yes, he's been at it again.
We've got a microphone attached to the computer, and this one is just simply measuring the loudness of my voice. And what I'm going to do is to teach it a word. I'm going to give it some samples of a particular word. Reverse. 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 And there it's got a picture of that word, and it's now making up an average out of those four and turning it into a template of that word. Now, I've already recorded some other words, and if I load those up now, we'll see if it can pick out one of those words that I've already recorded. We've got forward, reverse, stop, and pick up, words we might use to control a robot. So let's try. Pick up. And here comes the pattern. And now that pattern is overlaid onto the previous templates. And what the computer is now going to do is to measure the difference between the word that I've just given it and the templates it already has in its memory. And the first one you can see forward, 69% accurate, 70% for reverse. Stop is 73, and pick up, the one that I actually gave it, let's see how it does, 86% there, and that's the one it recognises.
A robot security guard that uses 2 television cameras for eyes stalks its way around the offices of the Californian company which designed it. But this clever piece of insect-like engineering is intended for use in more hazardous places than this.
Just had to show you that because it's quite funny. This is our robot that we use for the opening title sequence, and we thought, well, we might use it for something more entertaining. So you've got this rather nice piece that Mac does.
Well, despite its size and power, the robot has to be able to move with a great deal of precision. In this case, it's claimed it can move repeatedly within 1/5 of a millimetre of where it's been programmed to, and that's with 60 kilograms on the end of the arm at full speed. Well, we thought we'd put it to its test. We've put a pin in the end of the arm here. We're going to take an egg. We've programmed it to punch a little hole in the egg, and then it has to whirl around and go back through exactly the same hole. Well, there it is, just one hole. Well, you might ask why anybody would want to use a £35,000 robot to put a pinhole in an egg. Well, the answer's quite straightforward. It's to stop the egg from cracking when you boil it. Until next week, goodbye.
That's absolutely typical of Mac. Right. Okay, so we have those series going on, and in the end, if we look at the television series that we made, Silicon Factor 3, Managing the Micro 5, Computer Program 10, Making the Most of the Micro 10, Computers in Control 5, The Electronic Office, a series I haven't got time to show you a bit of, it was all film, Making the Most of the Micro Live, the 2-hour special, Micro Live, which we'll come on to now, 47 programs, micro file, which was used the best of MicroLive. Kristen is here, who remembers those, I think, fondly. The Learning Machine 6, with a little help of the chip, that's for disability. Electric Avenue, I can't remember Electric Avenue, because I'd gone by then to do other things, yes. And the Trojan Mouse, the retrospective. So there's a hell of a lot of television there. And people think, you know, they tend to think of these two series and forget that it went on for a long time. Now, I hope you find those quite entertaining. What we're going to show you at the end is a montage really of things from MicroLive. And the reason I'm going to show you those is because I have the feeling now that a lot of this material is of value historically, actually, particularly to a museum like this. And I have actually written to Tony Hall to see whether or not there's any way of getting the BBC to allow you to have copies, reasonable quality copies. Not most of these are off the internet, frankly. You know, most of it's there. It's just people are stealing the copyright, as it were, or avoiding copyright. But I think there's considerable value in a lot of these things, and we were there in MicroLive at a lot of key moments, which we didn't think they were key moments at the time, but they are key moments. I think those should be included within the, if you like, the compendium of programs. Anyway, shall we look at this? This is, forgive the quality, as I say, a lot of it's gone through a rather difficult editing process. And getting hold of these things is like getting hold of hen's teeth. Oh, by the way, we used to use the BBC Micro for that, generate that, the clock.
What happens is that the country or the town is divided into cells. And each of these cells is allocated a different frequency shown by these different colours.
I couldn't get hold of a tandem Mac, they're all hired out, so I've had to make do with one of Clive Sinclair's electric vehicles. These really are incredible. This is quite a large version of the equipment, but nevertheless, as you can see, totally portable. They do come smaller, and really at £1,300 they're half the price of the existing radio telephones. And it's ringing! Oh, if luck's on my side, Fref will answer in a minute. Hello, Fref. Is that Fref on the roof?
Yes, Leslie, in a car, I guess. It's Fref on an extremely cold roof.
Oh.
The information technology already exists to allow investors to use their computer terminals to buy and sell shares. Now, if that catches on, as it almost certainly will, there would be no real need for a stock exchange floor.
Most importantly, there's no guarantee that software written for, say, this machine would run on this one, even if we could load it. But the situation is even more bizarre than that. Sometimes software won't run on different models from the same manufacturer. And you can't link programs together, not unless you're a software genius.
I know how the computer treats me. This is downright rude.
Yes, it is. It is the first game that moves beyond being user-friendly. It's actually user-insulting, and because it lies to the user as well, it's actually user-mendacious. A little way down the line, we have a plan for a program which I hope will be the first one ever to get burnt in the Bible Belt.
Yes, the screen is an advanced form of the flat screen which we have coming in today, but now it's a large size.
Now it acts as a storage media as well. When you switch the computer off, it doesn't just disappear, it's there permanently and will stay there forever unless you changed it.
It's really electronic paper. And we can shuffle the paper around the board here and control it.
Shirley, just how bad is the situation?
In Britain, it's very bad. We have reason to think that something like 60,000 engineers with knowledge of information technology are needed right now by British industry.
3, 2, 1, go.
Oh, what? It tipped it!
Very nearly.
The way Fleet Street is now, the writing must be on the wall.
Well, that's up to Fleet Street to change. I mean, you've got to remember, I didn't create the environment that Fleet Street finds itself in. It was there before I was born. And I think we will be the most advanced newspaper in the world.
But it's now possible to produce a paper that doesn't use any ink or paper at all. It's delivered straight into its readers' homes by telephone line. Micronet produces 30,000 pages of news and information on computer technology
which is updated day and night.
Andrew, getting in and out of your office in Wapping, both tonight and last night, seemed quite a hazardous business. Isn't that too high a price to pay for new technology?
Well, I got here, and the paper will get to you on Sunday as well, so we're doing it.
But it is because I did not understand any of the instructions. It wouldn't do anything I wanted it to do. Total shambles.
Fair enough. You are winning now, aren't you?
I don't think so. I mean, it's I'm trying to do the last bit of it, and it keeps sort of stealing bits from here and...
I was hearing a lot of clattering and clacking going
well,
on.
I'm a two-finger typist. I type very fast and very inaccurately with two fingers, and I like old Underwood, you know, that you can hammer.
Politicians are turning to a new group of power brokers, consultants with a simple idea. They're taking developments in computerized direct mail advertising and telemarketing schemes, originally designed for private industry, and are using them to reshape the American political landscape.
Right, $1,000. I know it's an awful lot of money, but it's...
Well, I realize that's a lot of money, sir, and most people can't contribute at that level. The reason we ask, quite simply, I hope you'll understand, is that we don't get gifts like that unless we do ask for them.
I can actually view it from any angle, and there's no fall-off in definition whatsoever. Perhaps even more importantly, this little example was connected 3 years ago, and the image is still there and readable. This display requires no refresh.
Well, those trees were grown on DEC mini-computers, but you can grow your own on a micro. Here's a short fractal program using the BBC B.
Well, the Sunday Times announced last week that the bonanza in home computer sales is over. Well, this filled the city with gloom and wiped 5 pence off Acorn's shares overnight. Well, the reason the city is jittery is that many market analysts are saying that the home computer market has got nowhere to go. Eventually, everyone will get bored with the kind of software that machines under £200 are capable of running. The market for computers is obviously going to change. But for the Sunday Times to tell the boom is over is a little bit premature.
A lot of humanity, and that's difficult to believe it was generated entirely by computers.
Yes, absolutely, but that's great. That's a good point about it. I mean, who cares what it's generated by? It's an absolutely wonderful film. Gets my prize too.
But this is the first public showing of Acorn's development RISC machine. It's about 35 times faster than an IBM PC, and indeed it's 20 times faster than this BBC Master here, as you can see from this demonstration. In fact, at the moment they're both calculating a 3D graph based on sines and cosines. The Master is the small graph inset at the bottom right of your screen.
So there we are, 2 messages for the BBC. Don't throw anything away, and don't be afraid of being technical. Well, that's the end of my presentation, really. It would be very interesting to go on talking about what the BBC might do next, but it is a very different organisation from what it was, but it does have some things that we didn't have, many things that we didn't have. I think the problem is getting, frankly, is actually getting people to agree and to find someone to champion the thing and to really push it forward, you know. And in John Radcliffe and people like Sheila Ennis, head of department. You know, you had those champions and they had very easy access to channel controllers and board of management, board of governors. I mean, I remember we did demos to the board of governors, you know, they would sit there wondering what on earth this thing was and just nod. And we got it through, but it was risky, but they were very different times. Anyway, that's it really.
Well, I'm sure everybody wants to express their appreciation of fantastic.
Just throw money.
Incredible. So, thank you very much.